The morning sun cast long shadows across Millfield's dusty main street, but the usual bustle of frontier life had been replaced by an eerie quiet. Sarah McKenna stood behind the barred window of the makeshift jail, her calloused hands gripping the iron as she watched the townspeople gather in hushed clusters. Their eyes darted toward the jailhouse with a mixture of fear and condemnation that made her stomach twist into knots. 3 days had passed since Mayor Robert Garrison's body was found in his office, a letter opener buried deep in his chest. 3 days since Sheriff Coleman had burst through her boarding house door, his weathered face grim with accusation. "Mrs. McKenna," Sheriff Coleman had said, his voice heavy with reluctance, "I'm afraid you'll need to come with me. There's been some developments." Now, as she listened to the murmur of voices outside, Sarah could make out fragments of conversation that chilled her to the bone. Always knew there was something strange about that woman. Living alone, no husband to keep her in line. "They say she threatened the mayor just last week." The last comment made Sarah's jaw clench. Yes, she had confronted Mayor Garrison about the unfair taxes he'd imposed on her small seamstress shop, but threatening him. That was a dangerous exaggeration that seemed to grow more sinister with each retelling. The heavy door creaked open, and Sheriff Coleman entered, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Behind him walked a man Sarah had seen around town, but never spoken to, tall, lean, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. He removed his worn hat as he entered, revealing sandy brown hair that suggested he spent more time outdoors than most. "Ma'am," the stranger nodded respectfully. "Name's Jake Morrison. I work the Henderson Ranch just outside town." Sarah studied his face, noting the quiet intensity in his gaze. Unlike the other townspeople, there was no judgment in his eyes, only a careful assessment that made her feel less like a caged animal and more like a person worthy of consideration. "I've been listening to the talk around town," Jake continued, his voice low and measured, "and I have to say, some things don't add up right." Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Jake, we've got witnesses who heard Mrs. McKenna arguing with the mayor." "Arguing isn't the same as murder, Sheriff," Jake interrupted, his tone respectful but firm. "In my experience, when something seems too neat and tidy, it usually means someone's trying real hard to make it look that way." Sarah felt a spark of hope for the first time since her arrest. "You believe I'm innocent?" Jake's eyes met hers through the bars. "I believe in the truth, ma'am, and I aim to find it." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and stirring the dust into small whirlwinds that danced down the street. The sound seemed to underscore the tension building in the small town, where frontier justice often moved faster than careful investigation. "I appreciate your interest, Morrison," Sheriff Coleman said, his tone suggesting the opposite. "But we've got ourselves a clear case here. Mrs. McKenna had motive. The mayor was foreclosing on her shop. She had opportunity. She was seen near his office that evening, and we found her sewing scissors with blood on them in her room." "My scissors," Sarah gasped. "But I haven't seen them in days. I thought I'd misplaced them when I was working on Mrs. Patterson's dress." Jake's expression sharpened. "When exactly did you notice them missing?" 4 days ago, Sarah replied quickly. "I remember because I had to use my smaller pair to finish the hemwork." "That would be the day before the murder," Jake noted, glancing meaningfully at the sheriff. "Interesting timing for them to just show up with blood on them." Sheriff Coleman's face reddened. "Are you suggesting someone planted evidence?" "I'm suggesting we look at all the facts before we rush to judgment," Jake replied calmly. "This is a woman's life we're talking about." The tension in the room was palpable, broken only by the sound of approaching footsteps. The door burst open, and Deputy Harris stumbled in, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Sheriff!" he panted. "Judge Hawthorne's arrived from the county seat. He wants to hold the trial tomorrow morning. Says the evidence is clear enough that we don't need to wait for the circuit judge next month." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours to prove her innocence or face the harsh justice of the frontier. Jake stepped closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Mrs. McKenna, I need you to think carefully. Was there anyone else who had problems with the mayor? Anyone who might have wanted him dead?" Sarah's mind raced, fear making it difficult to concentrate. There were others. The Henderson Ranch was behind on payments, and Mayor Garrison was pressuring them hard. Mrs. Dalton at the general store was furious about the new licensing fees, and there was talk that he was involved in some kind of business deal that went bad. "What kind of business deal?" Jake pressed. "I don't know the details," Sarah admitted, "but I overheard him arguing with someone in his office a few nights before he died. A man's voice, angry. They were shouting about money and betrayal." Jake straightened, his jaw set with determination. "Sheriff, I'm requesting permission to examine the mayor's office and speak with potential witnesses." "You're not a lawman, Morrison," Sheriff Coleman protested. "No, but I've got eyes and ears, and I know how to use them. Unless you've got some reason you don't want the truth to come out?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Outside, Sarah could hear the sound of hammering. Someone was building a gallows in the town square, the rhythmic pounding a grim countdown to her fate. "Fine," Sheriff Coleman said finally, "but you've got until sundown. After that, we prepare for the trial." As Jake turned to leave, he caught Sarah's eye one more time. "Hold on, ma'am. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when good people refuse to let it stay buried." But as the jail door closed behind him, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that in a town where secrets ran as deep as the nearby silver mines, the truth might be the most dangerous thing of all. The wind outside grew stronger, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a storm brewing on the horizon, one that would test not just Sarah's faith in justice, but the very fabric of a community built on the harsh realities of frontier survival. The mayor's office felt like a tomb in the late afternoon light. Dust motes danced in the golden shafts streaming through the windows, and the metallic scent of dried blood still lingered despite the sheriff's attempts to clean the scene. Jake Morrison stood in the doorway, his experienced eyes taking in every detail before stepping onto the creaking floorboards. The desk sat in the center of the room, its mahogany surface polished to a shine that seemed out of place in the rough-hewn frontier town. Papers were scattered across it, some official documents, others personal correspondence. But it was what Jake didn't see that caught his attention first. "Sheriff," he called out. Coleman appeared in the doorway, his expression grudging. "Where's the mayor's appointment book?" "Every man in his position keeps one." Coleman shrugged. "Didn't find one. Maybe he didn't keep appointments written down." Jake ran his finger along the edge of the desk, noting the faint rectangular outline in the dust where something had been removed recently, or maybe someone made sure we wouldn't find it. He knelt beside the desk, his weathered hands examining the wooden floor. The boards here were old, installed when the building was constructed 5 years earlier, but one section near the safe showed signs of recent disturbance. Jake pressed down on the loose floorboard, and it gave slightly under his weight. "Sheriff, I'm going to need your permission to look under here." "Jake, you're wasting time on—" "Please." Jake's voice carried a quiet authority that made Coleman pause. "Mrs. McKenna's life hangs in the balance. What's 5 more minutes?" Reluctantly, Coleman nodded. Jake worked his fingers under the loose board and pried it up, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound appointment book and a bundle of letters tied with string. "Well, I'll be damned," Coleman muttered. Jake carefully extracted the items, his pulse quickening as he opened the appointment book to the days leading up to the murder. The mayor's neat handwriting revealed a schedule that painted a very different picture of his final days. "Look here," Jake said, pointing to an entry. 2 nights before his death, meeting with TB, final payment demanded. And here the day before, SM, shop discussion, 2 p.m. That would be Mrs. McKenna. So, that proves she was there. At 2 in the afternoon, Jake emphasized, in broad daylight with people around. Not exactly the time for a secret murder. He flipped the page. "But look at this, the night he died. TB, 9 p.m., no witnesses. Jake untied the letters, scanning them quickly. His face grew grim as he read. Sheriff, you need to see this. These are correspondence between Mayor Garrison and someone initiating TB. They're discussing payments for services rendered, large sums of money changing hands. Coleman leaned over Jake's shoulder, squinting at the papers. Services rendered? What kind of services? The kind that men don't usually write down in detail, Jake replied darkly. But from the context, it sounds like the mayor was involved in something that required payments to keep quiet. A new voice interrupted them from the doorway. Find something interesting, boys? And they turned to see Thomas Bartlett, the town's most successful businessman, leaning casually against the doorframe. His expensive suit was immaculate despite the dusty environment, and his smile didn't quite reach his calculating eyes. Mr. Bartlett, Sheriff Coleman straightened, unconsciously deferential to the man who owned half the businesses in Millfield. We're just finishing up here. Jake's grip tightened on the letters as he studied Bartlett's face. The man's composure was perfect, but Jake had spent years reading horses and cattle and men. There was tension in Bartlett's shoulders, a slight tightness around his eyes that suggested he wasn't as casual as he appeared. TB, Jake said quietly, watching Bartlett's reaction. Thomas Bartlett. The businessman's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I'm sorry. What did you say? Nothing important, Jake replied, carefully folding the letters and tucking them inside his jacket. Just reading some old correspondence. Well, Bartlett said, his voice carrying a subtle edge, I hope you find what you're looking for. It would be a shame if Mrs. McKenna's fate was delayed by unnecessary complications. After Bartlett left, Jake turned to Coleman. Sheriff, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. How long have you known Thomas Bartlett? Since he arrived in town about 3 years ago. Why? And in that time, have you noticed anything unusual about his business dealings? Any sudden wealth that doesn't match his known investments? Coleman's face grew uncomfortable. Jake, you're treading on dangerous ground. Thomas Bartlett is a respected member of this community. He's helped fund the school, the church expansion. With money from where? Jake pressed. His dry goods store and small cattle operation shouldn't generate that kind of capital. Not in a town this size. Before Coleman could answer, they were interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, Jake could see a crowd gathering around the jail. Angry voices carried on the wind, and the word lynch reached his ears more than once. We need to get back, Coleman said urgently. The town's getting restless. And as they hurried toward the jail, Jake's mind raced through the implications of what he'd discovered. The appointment book proved that Mrs. McKenna had visited the mayor during business hours, not at night when the murder occurred. The letters suggested that Thomas Bartlett had been paying the mayor substantial sums for unknown services. And Bartlett's appearance at the office seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. The crowd outside the jail had grown to nearly 50 people, their faces hard with the kind of frontier justice that had built, and sometimes destroyed, communities across the West. At the front of the group stood Bartlett himself, his expensive clothes and authoritative manner giving him natural leadership over the assembled townspeople. Sheriff Coleman, Bartlett called out as they approached. The people are concerned about security. We've heard rumors that Mrs. McKenna might try to escape before the trial. There are no such rumors, Coleman replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Nevertheless, Bartlett continued, we think it would be best if we posted a citizen watch tonight to ensure justice is served properly. Jake stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. I think Mrs. McKenna is secure enough in jail, Mr. Bartlett. No need for a mob. I mean citizen watch. The two men stared at each other, the tension crackling like electricity before a thunderstorm. Around them, the crowd muttered and shifted, sensing the undercurrent of conflict, but not understanding its source. Of course, Bartlett said finally, his smile returning. We're all just concerned citizens here. We want what's best for Millfield. Then we all want the same thing, Jake replied. Justice, Real justice based on facts, not fear. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake caught sight of a familiar face in the back, a weathered man in mining clothes who worked the claims outside town. The man's eyes met Jake's for a moment, and Jake saw something there that made his pulse quicken: recognition and fear. Later, as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the vast frontier sky, Jake made his way to the Silver Dollar Saloon. The mining man, Pete Crawford, sat alone at a corner table, nursing a whiskey with shaking hands. "Pete," Jake said, sliding into the opposite chair, "you looked like you had something to say back at the jail." Pete glanced around nervously before leaning forward. "Jake, you're playing with fire here. There are things in this town, things that go deeper than most folks know." "What kind of things?" "The kind that get people killed for asking too many questions." Pete's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That mayor wasn't the saint everyone thinks he was. He had his fingers in pies that would make your stomach turn." "Tell me," Pete drained his whiskey before continuing, "there's been a lot of silver coming out of the mountains lately. More than what's been reported to the territorial government. Someone's been running an operation, selling silver without paying taxes, without registering claims. And Mayor Garrison was involved? He was the one who made it possible. Falsified reports, bribed inspectors, kept the territorial officials from looking too close, in exchange for a cut of the profits." Jake felt the pieces clicking into place. "Let me guess. Thomas Bartlett was the one organizing the whole operation." Pete's face went pale. "I never said that name." "You didn't have to." Jake leaned back, his mind racing. "But something went wrong, didn't it? The mayor got greedy or nervous or wanted out. All I know is that a week before he died, Garrison was talking about making a clean breast of things, said he was going to contact the territorial marshal, come clean about the whole operation. Next thing we know, he's dead, and Mrs. McKenna's taking the blame." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the saloon windows. Jake knew that by morning he would either have enough evidence to save an innocent woman's life, or he would find himself standing against forces more dangerous than any storm the frontier could unleash. The truth was out there, buried in the secrets of a town that had grown too comfortable with corruption. But uncovering it would mean confronting men who had killed once to protect their interests, and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Rain drummed against the jailhouse roof like bullets, and Sarah McKenna pressed her face to the small window, watching water cascade down the glass in rivulets that blurred the outside world. The storm had arrived with the fury of divine judgment, turning Millfield's dusty streets into rivers of mud that kept most of the townspeople indoors, but not all of them. Through the rain-distorted glass, she could make out shadowy figures moving between buildings, their lanterns bobbing like evil spirits in the darkness. The citizen watch that Thomas Bartlett had organized was still active, despite Sheriff Coleman's assurances that it wasn't necessary. The sound of boots on the wooden walkway outside made her step back from the window. The door opened, and Jake Morrison entered, his hat and coat dripping wet. Water pooled at his feet as he removed his coat, but his storm-grey eyes were bright with purpose. "Mrs. McKenna," he said softly, glancing toward the sheriff's office where Coleman was presumably sleeping. "I've got news, some good, some that might put us both in danger." Sarah gripped the bars, her knuckles white. "What did you find?" Jake moved closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "Your appointment with the mayor was at 2 in the afternoon, just like you said. That's documented in his own handwriting, but more importantly, he had another meeting scheduled the night he died, with Thomas Bartlett." "Bartlett?" Sarah's eyes widened. "But he's been one of the loudest voices calling for my trial, because he's got the most to lose if the truth comes out." Jake quickly explained what he'd discovered about the silver operation, watching Sarah's face grow pale as the implications became clear. "So he killed Mayor Garrison to keep him from confessing to the territorial marshal," she whispered. "That's what I believe. But believing and proving are two different things. Jake glanced toward the sheriff's office again. Coleman's either too scared or too bought to pursue this line of investigation, which means a sudden crash outside cut him off. Through the window they could see that one of the citizen watch lanterns had fallen, its oil spreading in a fiery pool across the muddy street. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the sight of more lanterns converging on the jail from multiple directions. "Jake," she breathed, "they're not just watching, they're surrounding us." Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun as the front door burst open. Thomas Bartlett strode in, flanked by 6 armed men, their faces grim with purpose. Water dripped from their coats, and their eyes held the hard glint of men who had come to finish something. "Morrison," Bartlett said, his cultivated businessman's demeanor stripped away to reveal something much more dangerous underneath. "I had hoped you'd be smart enough to mind your own business. My business is making sure innocent people don't hang for crimes they didn't commit," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the guns pointed at him. "Noble sentiment. Unfortunately, Mrs. McKenna's guilt or innocence is no longer the issue." Bartlett stepped closer, his expensive boots echoing in the confined space. "The issue is maintaining the stability of this community. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions." From the sheriff's office came the sound of a door opening, followed by Sheriff Coleman's startled voice. "What the hell is going on out here?" "Sheriff," Bartlett called out without taking his eyes off Jake, "we've had reports of an escape attempt. We're here to ensure it doesn't succeed." "Escape attempt?" Coleman appeared in the doorway, his hair mussed from sleep, his gun belt hanging loose around his waist. "I've been here all night. There's been no—" One of Bartlett's men struck Coleman with the butt of his rifle, and the sheriff crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Sarah gasped and Jake tensed, calculating odds that weren't in his favor. "The beauty of frontier justice," Bartlett continued conversationally, "is its simplicity. A prisoner attempts to escape, there's a struggle, people get hurt. By morning, we'll have 2 bodies to bury instead of 1, and Millfield can return to its profitable tranquility." "Except for one problem," Jake said, his hand hovering near his gun. "I told people where I was going tonight. If I don't come back, they'll ask questions." Bartlett's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Who did you tell? Pete Crawford? He's already been persuaded to leave town permanently. Doc Henderson? He's got family to think about. Face it, Morrison, you're as alone as Mrs. McKenna." The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the jail in stark white flashes that made the armed men look like phantoms. But in that brief illumination, Jake saw something that made his heart race with hope. Movement outside the back window. Someone was approaching through the rain. "You're right about one thing," Jake said, raising his voice slightly. "Sometimes this community requires difficult decisions, but not the kind you're thinking of." The back door exploded inward as Deputy Harris burst through, his gun drawn and aimed at Bartlett's men. Behind him came Doc Henderson, Pete Crawford, and 3 other townspeople Jake recognized as honest citizens who had grown tired of Bartlett's influence. "Drop your weapons," Harris commanded, his young voice cracking with tension, but his aim steady. "You're all under arrest for conspiracy and attempted murder." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, guns pointing in every direction, 7 armed men facing 7 others in the confined space of the jail. The only sounds were the drumming rain and the harsh breathing of men balanced on the knife's edge of violence. "Deputy Harris," Bartlett said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone, "you're making a mistake. These men and I came here to prevent an escape." "Save it," Harris interrupted. "I heard everything from outside. The escape, the struggle, the 2 bodies by morning." "You always were too fond of the sound of your own voice, Bartlett." Jake used the distraction to step closer to Sarah's cell, his body shielding her from the potential crossfire. "Harris, the keys to the cell are on Coleman's belt. Mrs. McKenna shouldn't be trapped in here if shooting starts." "Nobody's getting shot if we all stay calm," Harris said, but his eyes never left Bartlett. "Thomas, you and your men are going to put down your weapons real slow-like, And then we're going to have a long conversation about silver mines and murdered mayors." For a moment, it seemed like Bartlett might comply. His expensive suit was soaked through, and he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like what he truly was, a criminal caught in his own web. But then his eyes hardened with desperate calculation. "You have no proof," he said. "It's the word of a condemned woman and a meddling cowboy against the testimony of respected citizens. Which do you think a territorial judge will believe?" "How about the word of a territorial marshal?" a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a tall man in a long coat, a silver badge gleaming on his chest. U.S. Marshal William Parker stepped into the jail, water streaming from his hat, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Marshal Parker," Bartlett stammered, his face going pale. We weren't expecting." "No, I imagine you weren't." Parker's voice carried the authority of federal law. "Especially since you thought Mayor Garrison's letter never made it to the territorial capital. Fortunately, he was smart enough to send a copy through different channels." Jake felt Sarah's intake of breath behind him as hope blazed to life in her eyes. The marshal continued, his gaze sweeping over Bartlett and his men with cold professionalism. "We've been investigating the illegal silver operation for 3 months, Mr. Bartlett. Mayor Garrison's cooperation gave us everything we needed to build a case. His murder was just the final piece of evidence we required to put you away for life." The fight went out of Bartlett's men all at once. Guns lowered, shoulders sagged, and the dangerous tension in the room deflated like a punctured balloon. Bartlett himself seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds, the weight of his collapsed empire crushing down on him. "Marshal," Jake said, "does this mean Mrs. McKenna is free to go?" "The charges against her will be dropped immediately," Parker confirmed. "We've known for weeks that she was innocent. We just needed Bartlett to make his move before we could arrest him." Sarah sank to her knees in the cell, tears of relief streaming down her face. The nightmare that had consumed her life for the past 3 days was finally over. But as Jake looked at her through the bars, he realized that while her legal troubles were ending, something else was just beginning. Outside, the storm was passing, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern sky. Soon, Millfield would wake to a new day, one free from the corruption that had infected it like a disease. But recovery, Jake knew, would take time, trust, and the kind of courage Sarah McKenna had shown in the face of almost certain death. As Deputy Harris unlocked her cell, Jake stepped forward to offer his hand. Sarah took it, and he helped her to her feet. Noting how her calloused fingers, strong from years of sewing, gripped his with surprising warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay—" "No need," Jake replied quietly. "Justice doesn't require payment, just the courage to seek it." But as their eyes met in the growing dawn light, both of them sensed that what lay between them was more than gratitude, more than the shared experience of fighting for truth. It was the beginning of something that neither the corruption of Bartlett nor the harsh realities of frontier life could diminish. The storm had passed, but for Jake Morrison and Sarah McKenna, the most important journey was just beginning. 3 weeks after Thomas Bartlett's arrest, Millfield was beginning to feel like a different town. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the community like a suffocating blanket was lifting, replaced by something Sarah McKenna hadn't experienced in years: hope. She stood in the doorway of her seamstress shop, breathing in the crisp morning air that carried the scent of pine from the distant mountains. The "closed" sign had been removed from her window, and through the glass she could see the familiar sight of fabric bolts and her sewing machine, tools of a trade she could finally practice without fear of false accusations or corrupt interference. The bell above her door chimed, and Jake Morrison stepped inside, his hat in his hands and a careful expression on his weathered face. He'd been by every day since her release, sometimes with legitimate business, a torn shirt that needed mending, a button that had come loose, but more often simply to check on her welfare. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet respect that had drawn her to him from the first day in the jail. Sarah, she corrected gently, as she had every morning for the past week. After everything we've been through, I think we're past formal titles. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Sarah, then, I brought you something. He reached into his coat and withdrew a newspaper, its pages still crisp from the printing press. It's the territorial paper. They ran the story about Bartlett's operation. Sarah took the paper, scanning the headlines that proclaimed justice served and corruption exposed. But what caught her attention was a smaller article near the bottom of the front page. Local seamstress vindicated. Community rallies around falsely accused woman. They make it sound like the whole town supported me, she murmured, a note of irony in her voice. The ones that matter did, Jake replied. Pete Crawford's been telling everyone who'll listen how you helped his wife when their baby was sick, working through the night to finish her dress so she could sell it for medicine money. Doc Henderson mentioned how you never charged Mrs. Patterson full price because you knew her husband's injury had left them struggling. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Those weren't favors, they were just the right thing to do. Exactly. Jake's eyes held an intensity that made her pulse quicken. That's what people are remembering now that Bartlett's influence is gone. You've been part of this community's heart for years, Sarah. It just took a crisis for everyone to realize it. Through the window, Sarah could see the changes Jake spoke of, where once people had crossed the street to avoid her shop. Now she had more business than she could handle. Women who had whispered behind her back were now bringing their families mending and asking for her advice on fabric choices. The isolation that had defined her life as a widow was slowly giving way to genuine community connection. There's something else, Jake continued, his voice taking on a hesitant quality that was uncharacteristic of his usual steady confidence. The Henderson Ranch is expanding their operation. They're looking for someone to handle the books, manage supplies, coordinate with the hands. It's good work, steady pay. Sarah looked up from the newspaper, sensing something important in his words. That sounds like an excellent opportunity for someone. They offered it to me. The simple statement hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah set the newspaper aside, giving Jake her full attention. In the weeks since her ordeal, she'd come to know the subtle signs of his emotions, the way his jaw tightened when he was working through a problem, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he was focused on something important. That's wonderful, she said carefully. The Hendersons are good people. You do well there. The thing is, Jake continued, his hat turning slowly in his hands, it would mean staying in Millfield permanent-like, putting down roots instead of just drifting from ranch to ranch like I have been. Sarah's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. And is that what you want, to put down roots? Jake's storm-grey eyes met hers, and she saw vulnerability there that he rarely showed. Depends on whether those roots would be welcome, whether there's reason to stay beyond just the work. The question implicit in his words made Sarah's breath catch. In the weeks they'd spent together, talking while she sewed, sharing coffee in the mornings, walking through town as evening fell, she'd felt something growing between them that was both thrilling and terrifying. The careful respect of their first meeting had deepened into genuine affection, and affection was blossoming into something that felt dangerously close to love. Jake, she began, then stopped, uncertain how to put her feelings into words. The last man she'd trusted with her heart had been her husband, dead these 3 years. The idea of opening herself to that kind of vulnerability again was as frightening as facing false murder charges. I know it's complicated, Jake said quickly, misreading her hesitation. You've got your business here, your independence. I'm not asking you to give up anything you've worked for. He trailed off, running a hand through his sandy hair. Hell, I'm not good with words like this. You're better with words than you think, Sarah said softly. She moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes, close enough to catch the scent of leather and honest work that always surrounded him. Jake, these past weeks, They've meant more to me than I know how to express. But, Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. But I need you to understand what you'd be getting. I'm not a young woman looking for a man to take care of her. I'm 32 years old, I own my own business, and I've learned to stand on my own feet. If this becomes something more, it has to be a partnership of equals. Jake's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in days. Sarah, I watched you face down false accusations, a hostile town, and the threat of hanging without breaking. I know exactly what I'd be getting. A woman strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me. The words were exactly what she needed to hear. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing against his calloused hand. The contact sent warmth shooting through her, and she saw the same response reflected in his eyes. In that case, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I think Millfield could use more good men putting down roots. Jake's smile widened, and he turned his hand to capture her fingers in his. Does this mean you'll have dinner with me tonight? Somewhere other than discussing business over coffee? I'd like that, Sarah replied, then added with a touch of her old independence, as long as we go somewhere I can pay my own way. Wouldn't have it any other else, Jake assured her. As if summoned by their moment of happiness, the bell above the door chimed again, and Deputy Harris entered, his young face bright with excitement. Mrs. McKenna, Sarah, Jake, I've got news. The territorial marshal says Bartlett's confessed to everything. He's pleading guilty to avoid the hangman's noose. The illegal mining operation, the bribes, the murder, it's all over. Sarah felt a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying lift from her shoulders. True justice, not just the clearing of her name, but accountability for all the crimes that had poisoned their community. There's more, Harris continued. The territorial government is returning all the illegally extracted silver profits to the town. They're talking about using the money to build a proper courthouse, maybe even a school building. Millfield's going to be a real town, not just a collection of buildings around a corrupt mayor's office. Jake squeezed Sarah's hand gently. Sounds like a good place to build a future. As Harris left, with promises to keep them informed of any new developments, Sarah and Jake stood together in the doorway of her shop, looking out at the town that had nearly destroyed her, but ultimately revealed the strength of her character. You know, Sarah said thoughtfully, I used to think that surviving meant just getting through each day without things getting worse. Now I'm starting to think it might mean something more. Like what? Sarah looked up at him, seeing not just the quiet cowboy who had saved her life, but the man who had shown her that trust and partnership were still possible, even after betrayal and loss. Like building something better than what came before. Like taking the worst thing that ever happened to me and using it as the foundation for the best thing. Jake's arms slipped around her waist, a gesture that felt both protective and respectful of her strength. I like the sound of that. Building something better together. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Millfield, its light banishing the shadows that had hidden corruption and fear. In its warmth, Sarah McKenna and Jake Morrison stood together, two people who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to believe in a future worth building. The quiet cowboy had indeed proved her innocence, but more than that, he had helped her prove to herself that she was worthy of happiness, trust, and a love built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and shared strength. As they began to plan their evening together, their first real step toward a shared future, Sarah realized that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from discovering that even in the harsh realities of frontier life, the human heart could find its way to hope, justice, and love. The story of her false accusation would become part of Millfield's history, but the story of what she and Jake built together would become its future. And that future, born from the ashes of corruption and watered with the courage to seek truth, promised to be as strong and enduring as the mountains that watched over their small town. In the end, justice had been served, but more importantly, two lonely souls had found their way to each other through the storm. And in a place where survival often came at the cost of dreams, they had discovered that sometimes, just sometimes, it was possible to have both.